What's going on, everybody? Welcome back into the Fantasy Pros YouTube channel. My name is Lucas Wencl, and today I'm bringing you 4 bold predictions ahead of Week 5 of fantasy football. Now, keep in mind, these are bold predictions, things that are unlikely to happen, but they are within the realm of possibility. If they hit, awesome. If they don't, it's what we expected. But before we dive on into those bold predictions, if you are feeling overwhelmed, juggling multiple fantasy football teams, Fantasy Pros will help you simplify things. With My Playbook's multi-league assistant, you can see the latest news, notes, and rankings for every single player across all your teams. It's all in one spot, making your path to victory clearer and easier. Dive in and let us help you dominate all of your leagues with the multi-league assistant at fantasypros.com/myplaybook or on the My Playbook app. Alrighty, y'all, let's dive on into these 4 bold predictions. Starting with bold prediction number 1, Deshaun Watson will finish Week 5 as a top 5 fantasy quarterback. Yes, I'm talking about the Deshaun Watson that has yet to throw for more than 196 yards in a game this year. In Week 1, he only had 169 yards. Week 2, 186. Week 3 is when we saw that 196, but then just last week in Week 4, only 176 yards. Yet, at the same time, only 2 quarterbacks have thrown for more passes than Deshaun Watson this year. That is Geno Smith and Dak Prescott. And Cleveland has thrown on 65.5% of their plays this year. That is second to only the Dallas Cowboys. So despite playing poorly, the Cleveland Browns are still putting the ball in Deshaun Watson's hands and want him to sling it around the yard. So now you look at the Week 5 matchup with the Washington Commanders, and there's a lot that honestly could go right here for Deshaun Watson. The Commanders' offense has been clicking the last 2 weeks. They put up 38 points against Cincinnati in Week 3, 41 against the Cardinals last week. Like, very clearly, Jaden McDaniels and Cliff Kingsbury are willing to go toe-to-toe through the air with any offense in the league. So, these opposing offenses, then, they have returned fire. I mean, Baker Mayfield in Week 1, he was the quarterback 2 at 29.7 fantasy points. Daniel Jones in Week 2, the quarterback 6 with 18.3. Week 3 was Joe Burrow, obviously. The quarterback 7 still had 25-plus fantasy points. And Washington, they've given up the 10th, or not the 10th most, they have given up the most passing touchdowns this year with 10 on the season. The only quarterback to not throw multiple touchdowns against this team was Kyler Murray in Week 4. There's enough that could go right here for Deshaun Watson. And the Cleveland Browns offense that isn't at the same level as we thought they would be this year, not the same level as they were last year. There's just a lot that could go right here for Deshaun Watson in what could end up being a decently high-scoring game here with the Washington Commanders. So bold prediction number 1, Deshaun Watson finishes the week as a top 5 fantasy quarterback, Now, bold prediction number 2. Breece Hall, we're going to get a little bit more pessimistic here. Actually, a lot more pessimistic. Breece Hall scores less than 5 fantasy points for the second straight week. I mean, look, in London, against this Minnesota Vikings defense, and this defense is just sick, man. They're currently giving up the Vikings the second fewest rushing yards per game, the 3rd lowest EPA per play, the 4th lowest success percentage, which is essentially, can you gain 40% of your yards needed on first down, 60% on second down, and then convert on 3rd or 4th down. The 4th lowest success percentage, and then lastly, the 7th lowest EPA per rush. The only running back to top 10 fantasy points against Minnesota this year was Jordan Mason in Week 2, and he did it on the back of 20 rush attempts for 100 yards. He only had 11.4 fantasy points on the week. He's also the only running back to have more than 55 rushing yards against the Minnesota Vikings this year. Devin Singletary in Week 1 only had 37, Cam Akers only had 21 in Week 3, and then just this last week, Josh Jacobs only had 51 with a game that got out of hand relatively early. Now, running backs have been targeted the 5th most times against the Vikings this year. That could be some saving grace here for Breece Hall, but they've been bottled up relatively quickly as the Vikings are bottom 12 in receiving yards allowed to running backs this year. So not much yardage after these receptions despite being targeted quite a bit this year. You also have to factor in Braylon Allen into this equation, and his role is increasing by the week. He's given 9+ touches in each of the last 3 weeks. He's been the more efficient runner than Breece Hall this year. He's averaging 4.8 yards per attempt, which is 1.7 more than Breece Hall. Breece is averaging only 3.1 yards per carry this year. And Breece Hall even mentioned in an interview, I think teams are locking in on me specifically And do we really expect that to change from Brian Flores in London against a 2-2 Jets team that just took a very bad loss to the Denver Broncos? I don't care what the weather is. You don't lose that game if you're the New York Jets. So all this in consideration, I am nervous that Breece disappoints again this week and we get another dud, whether it's only 9 points or 3.8 points like it was in week 4. Bold prediction number 3 now. Let's keep it moving here. This is, I think we're getting a little bit more bold with this one. Michael Pittman finishes as a top 3 fantasy wide receiver in week 5. Anthony Richardson, Joe Flacco, Uncle Rico, I frankly don't care who's at quarterback this week because Michael Pittman has feasted against the Jacksonville Jaguars for his career. Just this last year in week 1, in 2023, he was the wide receiver 8 scoring 23.8 fantasy points. In week 6, they played the Jaguars again. He was the wide receiver 9, scoring 19.9 fantasy points. Let's take it back one more year to 2022. He missed their week 2 matchup, but then they played again in week 6. He was the wide receiver 5, scoring 26.4 fantasy points. Let's go back one more year to 2021. Why not? Week 10, the wide receiver 31 wasn't that great of a week, 12.1 fantasy points, but then week 18, he puts up 20.4 fantasy points. Somehow only finishes as the wide receiver 17 on the week, but going back and looking at that week 18, that week was absolutely ludicrous for wide receivers. You had 18 different wide receivers score 20 fantasy points that week. But clearly, Michael Pittman has feasted against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, I know it's a little bit more risky with Anthony Richardson at quarterback, right? The guy has completed season low completions this year, but this Jaguar secondary is still exploitable. You have 5 wide receivers that have topped 70 yards against this team. 3 wide receivers have topped 100 receiving yards. They have given up the 4th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers, including the 3rd most receiving yards per game to wideouts. This is the perfect get-right game for this Indianapolis Colts offense, and they need to get their alpha involved, who's just coming off of his best game of the year with 113 receiving yards. So yes, we're going to get really bold with this one. We're going to say Michael Pittman finishes as a top 3 fantasy wide receiver this week. I think he continues to eat against a team he's dominated for his entire career. Last bold prediction, bold prediction number 4, Jordan Mason rushes for 200 yards and 2 touchdowns against the Arizona Cardinals. Yes, I am predicting a Derrick Henry against the Buffalo Bills on Sunday Night Football-esque kind of performance for Jordan Mason this week. Teams have been running on Arizona all year, and frankly, Kyle Shanahan should be looking at this matchup and absolutely salivating. Arizona, they have been run at the second highest rate this year. They are giving up 125 rushing yards per game to running backs. In the last 2 weeks alone, they've allowed 178 rushing yards per game to backs. And those have been shared backfields over these last 2 weeks. Week 3, it was David Montgomery with 105 yards and Jahmyr Gibbs with 83. Just this last week, it was Brian Robinson with 101 yards. And then here we go, a guy named Jeremy McNichols with 68 rushing yards. Jordan Mason has this entire 49ers backfield to himself. He has a 92.5 opportunity share, which is essentially the percentage of teams running back carries and targets. That is the second most in the league at 92.5%. He currently leads the NFL in rush attempts. He is second in rushing yards. He has rushed for 100 yards in 3 out of 4 games this year. And he has 100% of the team's red zone rush attempts currently. You just got Trent Williams back this last week as well, and in a divisional matchup, what better way is there to assert your dominance by playing some smash mouth football, good old ground and pound against a team that has been sacrificing a ton of yardage to the running back position this year. So I love the spot. I love the matchup. And again, I'm expecting this to be a Derrick Henry kind of week here for Jordan Mason. 200 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns against Arizona Cardinals this week. That is my final bold prediction. If you're juggling multiple fantasy football teams and feeling overwhelmed, FantasyPros will help you simplify things. With FantasyPros Multi-League Assistant, you can see the latest news, notes, and rankings for every single player across all of your teams. It's all in one spot, making your path to victory clearer and easier. Dive in. Let us help you dominate all your leagues with the Multi-League Assistant at fantasypros.com/myplaybook or on the MyPlaybook app.